our support for all day comfort. No one is scared about our support for men.
Welcome, everyone. Hi, I'm Katie Freeman. On behalf of Mystery Writers of America, welcome to the 77th Annual Edgar Award Symposium. Today's discussion is with the nominees for Best Critical Biographical. Our moderator is Joseph Goodrich, and our bookseller today is Murder by the Book in Houston, Texas. You can learn more about the Edgar Awards by following us on social media using the Edgars 2023 hashtag, or by visiting the websites mysterywriters.org and edgarawards.com. A reminder that the Edgar Awards will be live streamed on our YouTube channel, where this is also streaming today on April 27th. During today's discussion, I'll be posting links to our panelists' books in the chat. And please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box throughout the conversation, and we'll get to them at the end of the hour. We would love to see those questions, so put them in that box. To introduce our moderator tonight, Joseph Goodrich has been described by Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine as one of the most versatile writers in the mystery field. He is an Edgar Award-winning playwright whose work has been produced around the world. His fiction has appeared in EQMM, Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine, and 2 MWA anthologies. A selection of his nonfiction can be found in Unusual Suspects. His novel, The Paris Manuscript, was published in 2022. Thank you so much. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'd like to wish everyone a good afternoon or evening, depending on your particular locale. I am indeed Joe Goodrich, the chair of this year's Critical Biographical category, and I have the very great pleasure of serving as your moderator today. There's a long and distinguished tradition of history and criticism of the mystery genre. I think of Howard Haycraft, Frederick Denay, Julian Simmons. They all spring immediately to mind as partisans. The unfriendly and unwieldy Edmund Wilson, otherwise so astute a critic, appears as something of an enemy. At this late date, Wilson's animadversions appear blinkered, snobbish, even puritanical. The parade's moved on, and the mystery genre and its practitioners have had the last laugh. 5 noteworthy additions to the critical biographical canon have been nominated for this year's Edgar Award, and I'm delighted to introduce you to their creators in essentially alphabetical order. First, Martin Edwards, author of The Life of Crime, Detecting the History of Mysteries and Their Creators. Mariana Evans and J.C. Bernthal, editors of the Bloomsbury Handbook to Agatha Christie. David Geherin, I hope I pronounced that right, author of The Crime World of Michael Connelly, a study of his works and their adaptations. And Andrew Neiderman, author of The Woman Beyond the Attic, the V.C. Andrews Story. Lucy Worsley, whose Agatha Christie, An Elusive Woman, completes the list of nominees, cannot be with us today. So my thanks to you all for joining us. Congratulations on the nominations. I thought what we'd do is talk about your books for a spell, and then about 10 minutes before the end of the hour, we'll open things up for questions from the viewers. So I'd like to start this off as your gentle host by putting you all on the spot and asking you to provide our viewers with a brief description of your book and the reasons that prompted you to write or edit it. We'll start with, again, alphabetically more or less. We'll start with Martin. Good afternoon, Martin.
Good afternoon, Joe, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you, and it's great to be part of this panel and, of course, the shortlist for this wonderful award. The Life of Crime is a history of crime fiction across the world and across time. So a project that was either courageous and ambitious or foolhardy, but that was what I set out to do, to tell the story. And I do see it as a story of the evolution of this wonderful genre, and to tell it almost as a biography of crime fiction, but to do so by looking at individual lives of selected crime writers and taking those life stories as starting points for discussions of particular subjects. So that's what The Life of Crime is about.
Marvelous. And it's a great history. And I think it will rank as a standard bearer of all the mystery histories. Let's move along to Mariana Evans and Jamie Bernthal. Tell us about the Bloomsbury Guide.
Okay, I'll start, but I definitely want to hear Jamie's side of it too, because we probably come at this from different angles. I have been a crime novelist for 20 years and came to the study of crime fiction from the angle of trying to understand why it is we do what we do. Why do people read what we write? Why do we write what we write? And I've become very interested in crime fiction as the literature of justice. Is how we explore what's right, what's wrong, what's legal, what's moral, what's ethical, and how these things are not the same thing. This led me to Agatha Christie, who spent 50 years exploring different ways we can look at crime, punishment, and non-punishment. So I had begun writing about and speaking about Agatha Christie several years ago, and I received an invitation from Bloomsbury to edit this volume. They thought it was time, and Jamie and I think it was well past time for an assemblage of what is the work that's out there about Christie. Why was she important, and why is she still important? So after a moment of having heart failure about the size of the project, they encouraged me to seek a co-editor, and they encouraged me to seek someone on the other side of the Atlantic. And so I thought immediately of Jamie and contacted him, and the rest is history. But I came from it originally as a crime novelist who wanted to investigate the underpinnings of what I do for a living and what I teach. So Jamie, you tell them your side of it.
Yes, and I agree. Past time for a critical companion to scholarship on Agatha Christie. So I come from an academic angle, and I actually did my PhD thesis on Agatha Christie, and it was one of the first on Christie. And at that time, still people were not studying her or not admitting to reading her in a university setting. But since then, over the last 10 years or so, scholarship has grown so much that she's now canonical. She's a really quite respectable figure to study. So it's high time we had a volume that looks at all the different conversations going on in research about this absolutely remarkable writer. So when Mariana invited me, I absolutely kind of assaulted the keyboard with my agreement. For sure.
And a partnership was born.
a transatlantic meeting of the minds.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a fantastic collection, and I think one of the great things about it is the multiplicity of viewpoints that you get on, as you say, this increasingly canonical figure. It's all the books, by the way, that are being spoken of today. You should, if you don't have them, please pick them up from ideally your favorite independent bookseller. Let's move to David Geherin, and tell us about the crime world of Michael Connelly.
Okay, two minor corrections. My name is pronounced Geherin.
Geherin, okay.
And I also corrected my laptop problem, and I'm now I too am an academic. I'm a retired English professor at Eastern Michigan University, and I became interested in the semi-serious study of crime fiction in the 80s. Became interested. I didn't read much crime fiction as a young guy, but I remember reading a review of a writer I'd never heard of named Ross McDonald in the New York Times. And I was supposed to be writing my dissertation, but I picked up a Ross McDonald novel and I got hooked. And I over the years, I published, well, my Michael Connelly book is my 10th book on crime and mystery fiction. And I didn't have any long range plan, but each time a subject interested me, I wrote a book about it. And it turns out that many of my books were on more general subjects. One was on the history of the American private eye. One was on the role of, called Scene of the Crime. It was the importance of setting in crime fiction. One was on European crime fiction. But I also, in between, got a chance to focus on a single author. I wrote a book on John D. MacDonald. I wrote the first book on Elmore Leonard. A couple of years ago, one of my other favorite authors that I thought all was worthy of serious study was Carl Hiaasen. And after my last book, I thought there's another writer that I've long admired that I thought was worthy of a serious study. And that's what prompted me to write the book on Michael Connelly.
Interesting. Very good. It's a great guide, I would say, for either the Connolly novice or someone who's exceptionally well versed in the books. We'll talk about how that line, balancing the two between those readers who know nothing or a little and those who know everything. But first, let's move to Andrew Neiderman. I hope I've got that right. Neiderman?
Yes, that's right.
Author of The Woman Beyond the Attic.
Well, this is my second nomination for the Edgar Awards. I'd like to thank the committee very much for that. My first novel, Pim, was first big novel, was an Edgar nominee. I've been writing V.C. Andrews for over 35 years, besides my own novels. And at the point where Flowers in the Attic, which is one of the world's biggest best-selling books, had reached its 40th year, I thought it was time that we investigated and produced the biography of Virginia Andrews, an amazing woman to me, an inspiration for me. The great thing about writing biography of Virginia Andrews was she in herself was a huge mystery. She didn't publish until she was 55 years old.
Wow.
And she was a handicapped woman and basically homebound for most of her young and adult life. And getting into the truth of her life was a little funny in some ways because she had fun with reporters. She often told deliberately mistruths about herself and what was going on in her life. For example, she once said she was operated on by a surgeon who had a stroke during the operation and cut a part of her spine off. The reason why she was like that, which was fascinating, was because when she went to London, the reporter did a very bad view of her, made her sound almost like a creature. And she never liked interviews after that for quite a long time. She wouldn't do one, actually. So she was a real mystery. And here I had been writing her books for over 35 years. So I got a hold of the oldest person in the family, and there were a few left at this point, who helped me get into V.C. Andrews by going through her. She happened to have all her letters, all her thoughts on writing, and all her proposed novels. And with her help and an incredible interview with a woman 104 years old, her aunt, who's still alive, and she was working in Walmart at the time. We got to know the truth about V.C. Andrews and what was really part of her life in Flowers in the Attic.
That's most interesting because it's a name, V.C. Andrews is a name everyone knows, or the majority of readers, I would think, know, but so little is known about her. So the book is just a fascinating glimpse into a life that we knew nothing of, really. So
Right, that's true.
It's all the books, get them all. What I thought we might do now is we'll focus in on individual titles a bit. And it seems to me that since two of the nominees this year are concern the ever popular Dame Agatha, we might start with her. And Martin and Andrew and others, if you want to weigh in on the Agatha Christie question, please do. But let's start with the question, a simple question of why does Christie fascinate us so? What is the source of her enduring appeal? Jamie, any thoughts on that? Or Marianne, I beg your pardon?
Look, people who wrote it should probably know the best answer, but to me, Agatha Christie is endless in terms of time. You can read. I mean, her stories seem to still work, even the modern era. So, and I see a lot of people mimicking Agatha Christie stories. If you watch streaming TV, especially, you say, "Hey, wait a minute, didn't I see this before? This was an Agatha Christie novel." And I think that old adage, that imitation is the greatest compliment. It really applies to Agatha Christie because people are trying to be Agatha Christie everywhere.
She wrote the book, and you might say. Yeah. So Mariana, you want to address that?
I wanted to tag on to what he said about the eternal nature of the stories, in that I'm a professor not of crime fiction, but of writing. I write a creative writing, but I teach the mystery writing and the thriller writing classes and the suspense writing class at the University of Oklahoma. And so it's very important to me that my students read, as well as write. And so it's quite a balancing act to construct a curriculum that gives them a sense of the history of a genre, a sense of what people are writing now, yet preserves their time to write, because that's what they're in there for. And so Agatha Christie continues to be a favorite among very young people. They're intrigued by the plots. The plots still hold up. They're excellent teaching for me. It's like, look, there's a clue. Did you see how she did that, where she put it? They're also still interested in her, which is fascinating. She was born in 1890. The disappearance is one of the things, but the idea of a woman in 1928 getting on the Orient Express by herself. She was an interesting person. And that interesting part of her comes out in her books, and I think it still speaks to readers.
Yes, we think of her as a traveler, as a surfer,
Yes.
as a rather more daring figure than the staid Miss Marple informed image of her.
Right. People think of her as old because they remember her as old, but she wasn't always old. She was a very young woman when she started publishing. And if you go to the archives and read her letters with her publishers, first of all, for a woman in 1922, she was quite sharp with her publishers. Your math is wrong. The cover's terrible. I want a more modern cover. She was very clear that she was speaking to young people, and she wanted her books to be marketed as modern. And so when we think of her as a fussy old lady, we're wrong.
Yeah,
There's another aspect to a great writer that, besides the eternal aspect that you're mentioning, and that's the fact that anywhere you go in the world, any other country you go to, people will read Agatha Christie. It doesn't matter what their culture is and background. And I think that that's true for most great writers, is they have to have that ability to appeal to people no matter what their nationality or the backgrounds are. It's a universal story in a sense, and that's what she had. That's what V.C. Andrews had. There's a V.C. Andrews novel in every country in the world, even mainland China. And I always think that's an aspect of a writer that I think is wonderful to see. It's just universal, is what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely, yeah. Oh, Jamie, you mentioned something that I'd like to follow up on, and that is the increasing academic interest in Christie and her work. When did that start? Why did that start? What caused the shift in attitude, and I should say attitudes, concerning Christie and her novels?
Well, in a sense, people have wanted to talk academically about crime fiction, and Agatha Christie, who is the main crime fiction person, if you like,
epitomizes it in many ways, yeah,
for a long time, but was really in the kind of from the 90s onwards, attention started to get paid to her in academic context, and really in the last 10 years or so, we've seen increasing monographs, conferences, we've seen full-length studies devoted to her work, and I think a lot of that is about coming to accept that something doesn't have to be vacuous just because it's popular. In fact, the fact that she's an incredibly popular writer means she's doing something really interesting, and wouldn't that be useful to study? So the syllabus has been a bit more democratized in recent years, and Christie is, I think, rightly getting a lot of attention. And I think that people have underestimated her because she's so accessible, she's so popular. And yeah, most people start reading Agatha Christie as a child. Generally between 8 and 12 seems to be when people read their first one. But the fact that a child can understand and appreciate her work does not mean there's nothing to it at all. So she's just an absolutely ingenious writer, and I don't think we should dismiss something we take pleasure in.
Right. That's one of the great things that
That's a funny comment. Yeah.
But the great thing, like the Bowling Green, the popular culture thing, what we've learned is that across the line, it happened with the 60s and 70s for people like Howard Hawks, the movie director, or screwball comedy. The things that give pleasure are actually worth studying. What a radical idea that. Martin, do you have any thoughts on Agatha Christie's enduring appeal?
So, sorry, did you ask me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I began with Agatha, and I still love Agatha, and I absolutely agree with what has been said. And the point about universality is absolutely right. I think that as I grew up trying to find out about Agatha in the 1970s, there was very little information around, and things have changed remarkably, as Jamie has just been mentioning, in recent years, and very much for the better. And this interest has really overcome, I think, this what I think is a silly notion of Agatha Christie as cozy crime. Is not a term I'm particularly keen on, because I think it tends to be used sometimes, not always, but sometimes to patronize the work that she and others in the same field have done. And I don't think that if you read a book like And Then There Were None, or if you read the closing pages of Five Little Pigs, which is very, very dark indeed, that ending to that story, you can possibly think of Agatha Christie as cozy. There's more to it than that. And I think that these labels tend to be as unhelpful as labels like easy listening and things like that. It tends to denigrate even the great composers, and it's certainly the case that Agatha Christie is a great crime writer.
Yeah. Since we're talking, Martin, and I mentioned Julian Simmons earlier, would it be fair to describe your book, The Life of Crime, as first of all, what do you think of Simmons' book, Bloody Murder, which has excited some controversy of late?
Yeah.
You might say the singularity of his judgments and the harshness of some of them.
Yes.
And what do you think of Simmons, and could Life of Crime be thought of as a responsive sort to Mr. Simmons' book?
Certainly, it is that, amongst other things. And I read Bloody Murder when I was 17, 18, something like that, shortly after it came out, as soon as it was out in paperback. I'd read the reviews of the hardback, couldn't afford that, so I got the paperback, bought it, still have it. And it made a huge difference to me, because I'd been obsessed with crime fiction ever since I discovered Agatha Christie, but it was hard to get a lot of information about it. I would go to my local library a couple of times a week to get all the books I could, but it was hard to find out more. Stuff that wasn't in the library just wasn't available to me. And then this book explained the history. It introduced me to lots of authors I'd never heard of, lots of books I'd never heard of, lots of curious facts, the odd stories about some of the outlandish books as well. That fascinated me. And in fact, I actually wrote the only fan letter I've ever written in my entire life was to Julian Simmons. As people do, when I was about 20, and 22. And I wrote to tell him how much I admired it, but I couldn't resist the temptation to point out a couple of things I disagreed with. And in fact, he wrote back a very charming letter, which I still have. And I'm very pleased to report that the second edition embraced the point that I'd raised with him. So that felt very gratifying. Fast forward to the late 90s. By this time, I'd fulfilled my ambition to become a published crime writer. I'd written a few books, but I was still developing as a crime novelist, very much part-time. And I had a conversation with a very fine British writer, a friend of mine called Andrew Taylor, terrific writer. And he said to me, he said, one day, Martin, you really ought to write a kind of update of Bloody Murder. And Andrew remembers that conversation as I do. And I felt like there's no way I could ever do that. But 20 years later, the memory of that conversation came back. And of course, by now, it's 50 years since Bloody Murder was published. Things have moved on. There have been thousands of tens of thousands of novels written around the world. We know much more about crime writing in different parts of the world than Julian, whom I actually met in the early 90s a couple of times, much more than he knew then, because the books are more easily available. And that's a very positive thing. So we're able to broaden our horizons. And it's certainly true, as you've hinted, that Julian was a very opinionated guy. And of course, when his opinions coincide with mine, I think he's great. when they don't, I'm not so impressed. That's human nature. But he was a very rigorous judge. He's very rigorous in terms of assessing his own work, and sometimes is too harsh in relation to his own novels, let alone anybody else's. So and he did admire Agatha enormously. He was much less keen on, for instance, Dorothy L. Sayers. He was very negative about her, and I just don't agree on that. But his influence on me, not just as a writer about crime, but as a novelist as well, has been quite significant. And although there are many passages in the life of crime where I take issue with arguments that he advanced back then, my respect for his achievement is endless
and certainly in keeping with his achievements. Yeah. Julian Simmons wrote Bloody Murder. You wrote a book that's bloody excellent. David.
Yes.
In the Connolly book, I mentioned this a bit earlier. I've read a fair amount of Michael Connolly. I haven't seen all the adaptations. I haven't listened to the podcasts. So some of the plot material and such was unfamiliar to me, but I was never bored. One of the dangers of a guide that offers summaries and such and critical responses is that the reader who's not seen it won't be able to respond to it, won't know what's going on. But I had no problem with that whatsoever. And was that a challenge you consciously faced about the balance between, as I said, novice and devotee?
I'm very much aware of that. I mentioned I started reading Ross MacDonald when I was in graduate school, and I went on to read Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and so forth. And my specialty was 20th century British and American fiction. And I began to realize that a lot of these crime writers were doing things in their novels that I was talking about in my class about regular novels.
Right.
And I began to think that this distinction between crime fiction, inferior, serious fiction, not superior, was not always right. And over the years, I also developed and taught a lot of courses in crime and mystery fiction. And I always felt my job there was to introduce students to writers they probably had never heard of or hadn't read, and to try to talk about the things in the novel that were real, that made that book more than just a quick read. Entertaining, yes. First of all, it's got to be entertaining, but it can be something else as well. And fortunately, in my view, a lot of very good writers decided to become crime writers. And they could be talked about, treated in a serious manner as writing something worth reading, not just for its entertainment. And when I wrote the first book, the editor that I had at the time said, look, you're an academic, but we're trying to publish books that have an appeal to an average reader, someone who is not up to the latest in literary theory. And I've always kept that in mind. I want to treat the work seriously, but I'm aware that not everybody has read everything that I might be talking about. And I wanted to keep that in mind. I also wanted to avoid a lot of literary jargon. And one of the reasons I like writing the books on larger subjects like the scene of the crime, for example, I got to choose a wide variety of authors in different styles and so forth. And that sometimes was easier than writing about a single author because if you're writing about a series, the series can get pretty repetitious and you run out of things to say and you still got 20 books to write about.
Yeah.
But in the case of Elmore Leonard and Carl Hyacin, they didn't write series. So each book was a departure, new characters, new situations, and so forth. That kept it fresh for me. Michael Connelly has written 36 books, but they're not alike. He did two things that I think make him stand out as a series writer. He decided at the beginning that Bosch would age in real time. He would get older every time he wrote a book. And so you see the development of a character, the natural development of a character from a middle-aged man to a man in his 70s. Or he suddenly becomes a single father of a young girl and he has to deal with her through her teenage years. He also did what a lot of series writers do, and that is he started 2 or 3 or 4 other series to keep himself fresh. But he made the brilliant decision then of bringing those characters into the main series. So he had a very successful series with the Lincoln lawyer, Mickey Haller, but then he brought the two of them together, and there are several books in which they both appear. That's what he did with all of his separate series. So I call it kind of a megaverse. All of that, I think, kept the series fresh and gave me the opportunity at each book, whatever point it was in the series, to talk about something new, because there was something new in the book.
Yeah, and that's great for the reader, and I must keep Michael Connelly from being poured out of his skull. Oh my, no, but it was great. I will be watching a lot of films and TV shows now based on reading your book. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
Andrew.
Yes.
We were talking about very famous names and
Right.
about the unknown person behind them. Martin talked about how it was hard to find out information on various writers, various genres, up to a relatively recent point.
Mhm.
Tell us some more about who V.C. Andrews was and what the books are like. Everyone may know the name, but not everyone will have read Flowers in the Attic, or is she Southern Gothic? How would you describe what she does?
Well, that's one of the interesting things that we're talking about labels. When I first started writing V.C. Andrews, I noticed that in some bookstores they had her under horror, and some under terror, and some under detective, and some under YA, and nobody really knew where to put her. And I basically feel that V.C. Andrews created a genre in herself in the way she wrote her big books. Flowers in the Attic is probably one of the world's biggest selling books. I mean, I don't know anywhere in the world that doesn't have it. And anywhere I travel in the world, and I've traveled to many different agents and countries because of V.C. Andrews. When I say, V.C. Andrews, they might hesitate, but when I say Flowers in the Attic, everybody knows it. And to stress that point, when we decided to do Flowers in the Attic, The Origins, which was based on the first V.C. Andrews novel that I did, Garden of Shadows, Lifetime's series ran 4 2-hour episodes, and it was the biggest viewership in their history of anything that they did in series. So the following of V.C. Andrews, what is amazing about it is after 40 years, you have to realize it's still a big following. And as the writer of V.C. Andrews, I had to basically study V.C. Andrews the way you would do for a term paper or for a doctorate degree. I had to write in her style. I had to write her characters. I had to become V.C. Andrews. And there was a lot of amusing stuff with that too. A lot of people didn't know that I was writing V.C. Andrews, and when they found out, there was always an amusement about how does a man write from a woman's point of view. And my first novel, Sisters, was from a woman's point of view. So I think a writer has got to be able to be a bit of a multi-personality. Once you create the character, you have got to become that character. Otherwise, the story won't move, and the story should move according to the character. And basically, that was one of the things V.C. Andrews achieved. And the thing about Flowers in the Attic is it's full of mysteries. And everybody for 40 years was debating who did the poisoning of the children in the attic. Why would the mother do this? What was the grandmother's motivation? On and on and on. And there was never a clear answer because V.C. Andrews never gave a clear answer. In fact, when she wrote the book, she was basically stuck at home with her mother, who was kind of a love-anger relationship. I won't say hate, because her mother kept her from the public, basically because of her handicap. In fact, when she took her out to sit in the porch in the front of the house, she put her behind bushes because she was kind of embarrassed by her daughter's handicap. So what happened was when when Flowers in the Attic was published and she was 55, it became a huge worldwide bestseller. And all of a sudden, a woman who was, basically secluded for almost all of her life was burst into the world. And her mother couldn't stop that. In fact, she just went along with it at that point and, assisted her when she went to book signings and to talks and things like that. And it's just learning about all that, but learning about it from the people who were there was the most important part of it all. I could solve the mysteries that people were delving into for 40 years. And I finally could do that. And I was appreciative of the family, and they really wanted to have V.C. Andrews recognized at that point, biography-wise. So it was a challenging but a great endeavor for me. And of course, I continue to write V.C. Andrews. There are literally 105 titles at this moment of V.C. Andrews in the world, and there'll be more. And then the biggest announcement about a year and a half ago was that A&E Studios bought the franchise. They had made 19 movies. And I can tell you right now, there's going to be 11 more 2-hour movies. And we're going to continue the series. And that's just for the next year and a half. And it's just an explosive franchise, and it's exciting to be part of it. And I just appreciate and really respect V.C. Andrews for what she did, and glad to be able to honor her in the biography.
Absolutely. And what she accomplished under terrible adversity, you might say.
She had to be transported in a flat truck to go to book signings and stuff like that. She never really went out until a cousin of hers, who was younger than her, took her out to a nightclub where she could hear music and eat dinner out. I mean, you're talking about a grown woman who never had these experiences, and then she publishes a book that it's fascinating to also go into the story of Flowers in the Attic, because while she was in the hospital, this is a true story according to everybody who was there. Her doctor, one of her doctors, was fascinated with her. She was only a teenage girl, came over and told her the story of his life and said that he and his siblings were locked in an attic in a house.
There you go.
And she never forgot that, but she didn't really write it for another 40 years. Isn't that amazing? And then when she did write it, she never showed it to her mother. It was submitted to the agent who sent it to the publisher. Nobody knew what it was going to be. It came out and boom. And her mother said, "I'm not reading that book."
But there might be, for some future PhD student, a book to be written about the mothers, or maybe someone has written this, the difficult relationships women writers have with their mothers. You could look at V.C. Andrews, you could look at Patricia Highsmith.
Yes.
I'm sure others would come to mind. Someone who also didn't get out a lot, and I think this is more of a choice, was Miss Agatha Christie.
Yeah.
And I wanted to return to Jamie and Mariana for a moment, to find out. You worked transatlantically, right? Have you actually met in person yet?
Yes, but before the book, just at a conference, but before.
Oh, very good. Okay. How did you match the individual subjects in the book with authors?
Jamie?
We made our dream list, basically. And so we had our topics and we made our dream list of people working. What we wanted to do was to get the people who are leading the current conversation, and we did, which is really convenient. So what we did with this book, we wanted to do something which isn't necessarily the obvious thing to do, but is to get one of the big voices for each topic to write a summary of the state of scholarship at the moment. And sometimes academic writers don't like that sort of thing because they want to add a new idea or make their great contribution to the world. But we chose writers who've already made their great contributions to summarize the conversations that are happening. And I think one of the things that's unique about Agatha Christie is that people working on her universally love her. And it is quite rare to find a subject that everyone involved in really enjoys.
Yeah.
And that's made a lot of this process of writing and editing an absolute dream. In a way, I'm very conscious it isn't on every project.
No,
But this has been such a a labor of love, but the emphasis very much on love, not labor, I think.
I'm very happy to hear that, because the late Joan Shankar, who was nominated for an Edgar for her Highsmith biography, once told me, she was talking with Simon Callow, who, apart from being an actor, is also a biographer of Orson Welles and Charles Laughton, and his former literary agent. He said that the biographers, and this might apply to any writer focusing on a particular subject deeply, he said the biographer's dirty little secret is that you come to hate your subject. Simply because, as she explained it, or Simon Callow explained it, it takes over your life. You're living his or her life, or that person's life, as opposed to your own. And it's taking away from kids, it's taking away from family, from your world, and not forcing you, but implanting you into that world. So I'm happy to hear that Agatha is, I should say, Miss Dame Christie is an easy person to spend time with.
Our contributors uniformly said, if I love Agatha, thank you for asking me, because I asked a co-worker of mine, a colleague, who is not a Christie expert, but is a writer on race, gender, and the media, for her take. And her first response said, I read them all when I was a child. I'm so excited you asked. But it gave us a viewpoint that I think there hasn't been enough of. And then related to something I think it was Andrew said about translations, Christie too is widely translated all over the world, but one of our writers who has written a good bit about Christie in the past is Nadia Attia, who is Iraqi, and she wrote about Christie's work in what was then called the Middle East. And she learned that there were unauthorized translations in such quantities and in so many languages that when people say there are billions of her books in print, nobody knows really, because people would translate them on their own, publish them on their own. The state would never know. And that's just one region of the world. Wow. It likely happened everywhere. And then the one other thing I wanted to really also in response to Andrew, I wanted to slide in. He was talking about the response in China of the translations of Andrew's. And I think Christie has that same kind of wide appeal, because I was speaking to her grandson who wrote a chapter for us. So Matthew Pritchard, Christie's only grandchild, gave us access to photographs, gave us access to the archives, and wrote a chapter for us. And I had the honor of meeting him. And first of all, he says, well, what do you want to know about my grandmother? And I'm like, just dumbstruck. I don't know what to say. So I asked him some things about my own research. I'm interested in justice and the legal system. So I said, she was 30 years old before she was able to vote. Did she vote? He said, well, clearly I wasn't alive, but I feel like she would have been one of the first women to go sign up. So that was fascinating. But then I let him talk about what he wanted to talk about. And he knew I was interested in witness for the prosecution. And so he said, well, we've recently translated it into Chinese and had a big premiere in China, and I was there. And he said, you never know culturally how these things will translate. And anybody who knows witness for the prosecution knows that there are 4 twists at the end. And he said, the response, he said, I don't speak Chinese, but I knew when every one of those twists hit, because the audience was mad. So it was clearly cross cultures. And so and how fun that must have been for him. So I wanted to make sure to tell that story.
That point you made about whether you love or hate the person you're writing about. I think if you're a writer, and everybody here is a writer, you get in. For me, to see someone persevere up to the age of 55, it was amazing. I mean, that gave me so much inspiration. And whenever anybody asks me how do you become a writer or an entertainer or anything? I say, well, the honest answer is it's 60% perseverance and 40% talent.
Yeah.
Because if you get
It's not
turned
hard.
down and you get turned down and you don't keep coming, you probably should not go. You know, you've got to have it in you to just keep banging on the door. It took me 25 years to get Hollywood to buy a V.C. Andrews novel,
Wow.
but never stopped banging on those doors.
Amazing. Oh, Martin, a quick question for you. We were talking about people one loves to write about, enjoys writing about, finds pleasure in writing about. In working on Life of Crime, do you have any difficulty dealing with writers whose work you didn't especially appreciate but needed to be included because they're important? Or did you feel just that mix of how to describe it? What one likes versus what the historical record shows, if that makes any sense.
Well, it does make sense, but I had a big advantage in that I'm very keen about crime fiction of really all different types, provided it's good. We all know that over the years there have been many, many bad crime novels written, and there are bad crime novels being written today, and there will be in 50 years' time. We understand that. That's true of any genre. But the truth is that there are many, many terrific novels. And one of the things I've always believed from a pretty young age, having, as I say, begun with Agatha and moved on through Sayers to Simmons and Michael Gilbert and then the Americans and further afield. One thing I've believed very firmly for a very long time is this: just because I like Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers, it doesn't mean that I can't also like Dashiell Hammett and Soji Shimada and Ragnar Jonasson and Fred Vargas and many different types of crime fiction. And I think that one of the problems, in fact, Andrew mentioned the difficulty of categorizing V.C. Andrews. I think that I understand the value of labels for bookshops and libraries and publishers. I understand it, but it can be a trap. And I'm not a great believer in putting too much importance on labels. Even crime fiction itself, the boundaries are pretty elastic. You know, do we include Kafka? Do we include Dostoevsky? Do we include the Luminaries? Do we include A.S. Byatt? And so on. The great thing is to focus on the pleasures of good writing and the many different facets, not just of the roller coaster nature of the writer's life, whether it's Ross MacDonald and Margaret Miller, who are discussed extensively in the book, or Patrick Hamilton, who is much less well known, but I'm very interested in. He features in the book. But to try to show that beneath the apparent differences in terms of period, in terms of writing style, in terms of subgenre, there are actually many things that connect these books and these writers. Mm-hmm. And these are the things that I'm keen to focus on, those positives. I couldn't have written this book if I hated crime fiction, or indeed if I'd hated many of the writers that I write about. Of course, I have my preferences, but I do think that one of the great merits of crime fiction is it's such a broad church that there is something there for everyone. And also, even if you think you're just a hard-boiled fan, mm-hmm. You can find a lot of pleasure in other types of crime writing as well.
Good writing is good writing, whatever the subgenre of the form it takes. We're about at question time now. This has gone by very quickly and fascinatingly, and I think we'll turn to a couple of questions here. Let me dig them up here if I can. Let's see. Marjorie Tucker would like to know, what do nominations and awards mean for you and for your writing? Is there any impact for you?
Yeah, I think it's wonderful to have something like that happen to you, because you know, it's an acknowledgement that something you've worked hard on, given you time and your life into, is recognized by other people.
Yeah.
And I think that as a writer, no matter what people say, like writing in some kind of a, stowaway somewhere and you're writing for yourself. I once spoke to 250 young writers, and I walked out and I said, I'm going to tell them the truth. And I said, publishers want to make money. And they were like shocked, like, why do you write? Well, you write for your self-pleasure, of course, but when you get acknowledged, that's a great moment.
Indeed. David, what are your thoughts on the nomination?
I agree. This is actually my third nomination, and each one has pleased me immensely. I write the kind of books that don't sell widely, library sales primarily rather than individual sales. A nomination, however, is a recognition that your work at least is reaching the kind of audience you want to be reached. So I'm very appreciative of the awards, and very happy to be amongst fellow nominees here today.
Absolutely. Jamie?
This means a huge deal, partly because this is a book that we co-edited, Mariana and I, but there are so many contributors to it. And it's very, very lovely that their hard work is paying off, and especially some who maybe haven't written this kind of thing before, to get that acknowledged. It's also just, I feel silly because obviously she's the most successful writer in the world, or novelist in history, but I feel very happy for Agatha Christie that she's getting this kind of acknowledgement, and that there are 2 books with her name in the title in this year's shortlist, and she is
absolutely
discussed very widely, and it's just good that we're having critical conversations about all these writers, really.
Mariana?
Oh yes, the nominations are gratifying, because we all spend so much time alone with our thoughts. It's nice to know that other people have read our thoughts and thought that there was merit to them. The Edgars in particular, and as a crime novelist, these are my peers. So the Edgar nomination means a very great deal. And those of us who are academics, this is something that our peers understand. My dean was very excited about the Edgars nomination. The fact that I'm going to be in New York at the banquet literally 1 week before finals week shows you that they're happy for me to go.
They were very happy, very happy.
So I know I'm not the only academic here, and so we all know what it means.
I expect you're happy, Martin.
I am happy.
Very
John.
good.
Yes, it's a great honor, and the other, I agree with all that's been said, but morale is a very fragile thing for most writers, as The Life of Crime tries to illustrate, and this kind of recognition is very good for morale. There's no doubt.
Indeed it is. I think we have time for one more question. That's from Donna Moore, who would like to ask everyone, was there anything you discovered when writing about your chosen author or field that surprised you? Since you're here, Martin, why don't you start? Something that surprised you about a chosen author or a field or a genre? Something you discovered?
Well, I of course, covering such a wide field, that there were many discoveries, but I think that the thing that struck me time and time again is these unexpected connections between books and writers from different backgrounds, different countries, different continents, and it's those the discovery of these almost endless but unexpected connections that particularly fascinates and delights me.
Mariana?
I had the pleasure of going to, I think, 4 archives to do this book and to do another book I'm working on. And we'd be here all day if I told you all the surprises I found in the archives. But I think my favorite one, because of the way it fits into my research on women's experience of the legal system as Christie portrayed it for 50 years, is in the archives in Reading, where we have her business correspondence. And as I've said, she's very sharp in her correspondence with her publisher at a time when women had just gotten the vote and were not yet considered full persons under the law. Their husbands were in charge of all of their business affairs. They did not yet have full rights. So in 1921, as she's starting her career, there are a couple of letters from her husband asking for details about his wife's royalties and all, which seems very weird to us, but probably was normal at the time because her money was his. And then there are no more letters from him. There is a barrage. There are daily letters from her with details of her business life. So it became quickly, and this is no slam on him, he was doing what he was brought up to do, but it became quickly apparent that she did not need her affairs managed. And it's just fun to watch that exchange take place.
Her emerge as in charge of every aspect of her life.
Yeah, the Christie that we know was being formed at that time, and you can see it on the page. And I guess that was my surprise.
Wow.
Yeah.
David, any surprises from the world of Michael Connolly?
No, and that's good. I mean, when you start off and you know you're going to have to read 36 books, you don't want to get.
You don't want surprises.
You don't want to get to the middle and say, "Oh no, I got to read another one."
Right.
The fact that I wasn't surprised that there was a consistency, and each book had its own pleasures. And along the same lines, in some of the other books, for example, when I wrote "Scene of the Crime," the surprising thing to me was how many new authors I was able to discover that I didn't know about. I wanted to write about places, and I ended up writing about crime writers that I had not previously heard about because they wrote about a particular place. And it was that constant, surprising discovery of how many great authors there are that we don't always all know about.
Exactly, yeah. Andrew, any surprises?
Yeah, well, to me, the surprises were how much of Vicentia's life really was in Flowers in the Attic, and what actual anecdotes, incidents appeared in the book, how she translated her life into a fiction. And the second surprise for me was I never knew how much she knew about her own illness and how she kept it a secret and literally was on the set for Flowers in the Attic, like week maybe before she was going to die. But no one in the cast, when she had dinner with them, no one in her family even knew how bad how sick she was. And that kind of courage and perseverance and determination, when I finished writing the book, I was more inspired and more eager to get into my own work.
Yeah.
That was a gift that V.C. Andrews gave me.
That's truly inspiring. Jamie, any quick thoughts before we wrap things up?
The main thing I discovered is that it's impossible to get bored of Agatha Christie or of any really good crime writer.
That's fantastic. So we have indeed run out of time. So let me thank our distinguished guests, Martin Edwards, Mariana Evans, Jamie Bernthal, David Geherin, and Andrew Neiderman for joining us today. And I hope to see as many of you as can be there at the Edgars. My thanks as well to Kathy and Kate and Marjorie and MWA for making this event possible. And for everyone who tuned in. Let me see if there's anything else we need to acknowledge or say. Last one for attendees, join us this Tuesday, April 11th at 7 p.m. for a conversation, great, with the special award winners, including Grand Masters Joanne Fluke and Michael Connolly. What else? I think that's about it. Kathy or Katie can bring in any other thing. That's something I might have missed. But I thank you so much. This was just a splendid hour. I wish we'd had another 3 or 4 to continue talking. Congratulations, and I hope we'll all get to meet at some point. Because I certainly love the books.